Thanksgiving used to be our small, stubborn miracle, a day we wrestled back from the year's bruises and told ourselves we still had something warm in the middle of the cold. After her mother left, it was just the two of us at a wobbly kitchen table with a rotisserie chicken I pretended was a turkey and paper napkins I folded like linen. I worked swing shifts pouring concrete and took weekend handyman jobs to keep the lights on and her dance recital fees paid. When she broke her wrist in 7th grade and couldn't tie her hair, I learned YouTube ponytails by flashlight because the power bill was overdue again. I told myself that if I kept showing up, kept lifting the heavy things, love would stay stitched where it belonged. But sitting at her grand table years later, crystal, candles, and cutlery aligned like soldiers, I realized I had become an uninvited footnote to a story I wrote in my own blood. The room hummed with bright talk designed to exclude. Her husband's family compared ski passes and stock options. Her mother, my former wife, now lacquered in money she didn't have when we were counting coins, laughed like the punchlines had been rehearsed. A cousin made a joke about old-school men who don't adapt, and several faces tilted toward me, casual as a knife laid flat. I tried to catch my daughter's eye. Once, she would look to me across any room and find an anchor. Tonight she floated with the tide that clapped for her degrees, her magazine features, the townhouse with the black-paneled kitchen I helped paint without being asked to stay for dinner. When she finally turned toward me, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Dad," she said, crisply, like the first cut into the turkey, "you're not needed anymore. Please leave." Before we continue, be part of our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. And here's something fun. Share your name and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. We might feature you with a shout out in our next video, because your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's proceed. The words landed with a hush that felt deliberate. Someone set a glass down a little too hard. The chandelier threw trembling light across the table like a heartbeat trying to steady itself. My first instinct was stupid and ordinary. To explain myself, to remind them that the calluses on my hands were letters she learned to read, that the rent I paid and lunches I packed and embarrassments I swallowed were the bricks in the path that led her here. I closed my mouth. I folded my napkin and laid it carefully across my plate, the way I taught her to do when she was 4, and we held tea parties with chipped cups. I stood. The chair legs scraped the oak. It sounded like a verdict. I walked toward the foyer, feeling the familiar weight of being the one who leaves so others don't have to look at what's broken. My hand found the doorknob's cold metal, and then it let go. I turned. "Before I go," I said, softly, without heat, "I'd like to introduce you to my new friend." A few smirks bloomed, pitying, indulgent. Her husband raised his eyebrows like I'd reached for a last scrap of dignity. My ex-wife's smile tightened, which is what she does when anything unpredictable happens near the centerpieces. Only my daughter's face stayed perfectly still, as if the stillness itself could control the weather. I opened the door. The November air stepped in first, brisk and unapologetic. Then the man followed. He wore a dark suit you don't buy off a rack and an expression you don't mistake for a social call. He was not young, not old. Ageless in the way of people who have seen too much and turned the seeing into a profession. Under his arm sat a thick document binder, corners dog-eared, tabs blooming like bruises in primary colors. He nodded to me once, then to the table, and set the binder down in front of my daughter's plate, neatly between the cranberry sauce and a linen napkin folded like a sail. I watched the color drain from her face with terrible, surgical swiftness. "Good evening," he said, the way a judge might say it. "My name is Evan Mercer. We've met." A flicker in her eyes, then panic slipped and showed its teeth. "Evan, this is not," she swallowed. "Not here." The room sensed it before it understood it. This was not a father grasping for attention. This was a convergence. Evan opened the binder. The pages didn't whisper, they announced. Wire transfers, loan schedules, notarized affidavits, emails printed with headers that give you nowhere to hide. He slid the first sheet forward. A promissory note, 6 figures, and then a digit more, signed with a looping signature that looked exactly like my daughter's and nothing like the version she keeps for receipts. The second sheet, a power of attorney draft she had sent to a notary and then withdrawn, the metadata timestamped at 2:11 a.m. on a Sunday, when she had promised her husband she was at a women's leadership retreat. The third, photographs. Boardroom glass reflecting a face too tense to be proud. A handshake with a man whose money you don't borrow unless you intend to pay in more than money. Her husband reached for the papers with the reflex of someone who thinks explanations are objects, and he can pick the right one. "What is this?" he asked, as if the question could make the last 10 minutes rewind. My ex-wife leaned back, eyes narrowed the way they used to when she accused me of misplacing things we couldn't afford to lose. My daughter shot me a look that mingled anger and pleading, and for a heartbeat, a single, cruel heartbeat, I thought of the first time I carried her through a doorway after a fever broke. "Dad," she said, voice low, "tell him to stop." She was not talking to Evan. "I hired him," I said, and the room tipped slightly, the way an elevator tips when it begins to rise. Months ago, I kept my voice level and left out the part where I saw an unfamiliar envelope on my kitchen table last spring. A bank's name I recognized for the wrong reasons, my address typed beneath a salutation that made my stomach drop. I left out how I called the number, got put on hold, listened to flutes that were supposed to calm me while a stranger told me my name appeared as a cosigner on something I had never touched. I left out the way my hands shook when I printed out my credit report and found inquiries I didn't recognize, the small bites, and then the bigger chunks missing, and how I sat at that wobbly kitchen table, the one we never replaced, staring at a life I had held together by force and faith and duct tape, and realized someone I loved had learned how to cut. I asked Evan to find out what I was missing, I said. He did. Evan did not play to the gallery. He kept to the facts like a surgeon to the plane of tissue. MS. "Hart," he said to my daughter, "you entered an agreement with Northbridge Partners 14 months ago for liquidity against future compensation, collateralized by restricted shares you did not fully own. You serviced the debt with funds diverted from 2 accounts you manage for your nonprofit consultancy clients. When those funds ran short, you created a secondary promissory note." His finger tapped a date, and added your father's name and initials to the draft without his consent. You did not file the draft. You did, however, use it to obtain a private extension with an affiliate who is not regulated in this state. He slid another page forward. "We have their emails. We also have a recording you may have forgotten you consented to at a meeting in June. Would you like me to play it?" Her mother spoke first, brittle and furious. "This is a family dinner," she snapped. "You have no right." Evan turned a page without looking up. "Mrs. Hart," he said, neutral, "I have a court's right." He tapped the top sheet. "Temporary restraining order, granted this afternoon. It bars your daughter from transferring, concealing, or dissipating assets under dispute. Notice of hearing Monday at 9. He slid a smaller envelope toward my daughter. "You have been served." The sound her husband made then had no word inside it. He looked at me as if I were the one who had betrayed him, which is a common mistake people make when truth walks in through a door they didn't open. I remembered the day I taught my daughter to ride a bike on cracked asphalt behind our apartment building. I ran behind her, one hand steady at the seat, telling her not to look down. She wobbled, shrieked with laughter, and then found balance. "I'm doing it," she yelled, awestruck by her own velocity. I let go. That was my job, to hold until holding became an obstacle, to release at precisely the second she could carry herself, to clap when she flew. Years later, when she launched her company, she sent me a photo of a ribbon cutting and said, "We did it." I printed it and taped it above my stove. Now she stared at the papers like they were a language she used to speak, but had forgotten in a country that rewarded amnesia. "I was going to fix it," she said, voice scraping against the edges of the room. "It was temporary. I just needed." Her eyes darted to her husband, to the in-laws, to a future she had curated like a museum exhibit. "Dad, I would have told you." The lie was small in shape and enormous in weight. and I watched it crush us both. I thought of the mornings I left for the job site before dawn, of eating a banana in the dark so she could have the last piece of toast, of the winter I wore the same coat while she grew out of hers, and I learned to sew sleeves with fishing line. I thought of the night she called crying from college because her car wouldn't start and I drove 6 hours with a thermos of coffee and my old toolkit, and how the first thing she did when I arrived was hand me a sweater she'd knit to replace the coat that had finally fallen apart. There are debts that are not numbers. There are ledgers no one but a parent can read. You used my name, I said, still quiet, because anger felt like giving her away to stand. Not because I had money. Because I have the one thing you cannot buy with degrees and applause. She blinked. What? Reputation, I said. The long, dull record of showing up. Evan closed the binder. I advised your father to wait until tonight to confront you privately, he said to my daughter. But counsel for Northbridge filed before lunch and set the hearing. They would have served you tomorrow. Your father did not orchestrate the timing. The implication hung there. The mercy in doing this in front of people who would one day tell the story back to her, softer than it deserved to be, because she is theirs. The room broke then in different directions. Her husband stood too quickly, knocked his chair back, and muttered something that was meant to be a question but sounded like a plea. An aunt whispered, "Oh, God," the way some people pray when they've never believed. My ex-wife reached for our daughter's hand, and then seemed to remember that cameras live in everyone's pockets now and pulled back. A cousin stared at me as if I had unwrapped a present too soon. My daughter stared at the envelope, at the injunction, at the Monday morning where she would stand in shoes that had always carried her forward and feel, for once, the gravity of standing still. I could have stayed and made a speech. There were 1,000 versions of it stacked in my throat like plates. I could have told them how secrets rot the beams from inside and leave houses looking perfect until they fall. I could have shouted. I could have listed the thankless things out loud and insisted they tally them on a whiteboard beside the dessert menu. I didn't. I looked at my daughter the way you look at a horizon you know you won't reach by nightfall. I'm leaving, I said, and it was not the exile she had intended. Not because I'm not needed. Because I will not be useful to your lies. I nodded to Evan. He nodded back, businesslike, and slipped a card beside the binder. 3 lines of text, a number, a fact that would not bend. The cold met me like an ally on the porch. Behind me the house erupted. Voices tripping over one another, the brittle crash of a plate meeting tile, the strained command of someone insisting this could be handled. I walked down the path I had edged myself last summer while she was at a conference I later learned was a negotiation. The maple leaves had crisped to coins. They rang under my shoes. I thought of the little girl who once could not sleep unless I left the hall light on, and the teenager who once didn't speak to me for a week because I couldn't afford the senior trip. Love expands and contracts. It is a long. Tonight mine exhaled what it had been holding. The hope that my quiet endurance could substitute for her courage. At the sidewalk I stopped and looked back at a window where candlelight jittered like a confession. The empty chair at that table would not be mine in the way she imagined. It would be a space shaped like truth, the kind that sits down uninvited and refuses to move. She thought dismissal was power, that humiliation could be an inheritance. But power is the opposite of pretense. It is the refusal to lie to yourself about what you have done and what it costs. I put my hands in my coat pockets and felt the old house key I still carry, though the lock changed years ago. I keep it not because it opens anything, but because it reminds me that doors once turned for me when I asked gently. At the corner, a wind came up that smelled like snow. I imagined Monday morning. A hallway outside a courtroom where polished shoes echo and people practice versions of honesty. I imagined my daughter signing her name the right way. No flourish, no theft, just the quiet script I taught her the day before kindergarten on the back of an electricity bill. I imagined a future where she calls me not to borrow a reputation, but to earn one. Those are pictures a father is allowed to keep even after he has been told to leave. Forgiveness is not a gate that opens because someone pounds. It is a hinge you oil in case one day the door needs to swing. I walked on. The street was empty, and for once that emptiness did not accuse me. Somewhere behind me, a tradition rewrote itself, clumsily and late. I have been many things in my life. Broke, tired, wrong, stubborn, the man who fixes in the dark what others broke in the light. Tonight, I was something else, finished with pretending. She had said I was not needed. Maybe she will be right someday. Maybe she will learn to breathe underwater without borrowing someone else's air. But if she ever chooses land, I will be there, not to be used, but to be known. That is the only kind of love that survives the long winter. And so I left the house as I entered it, alone, carrying nothing, certain of only the simplest arithmetic. What you hide owns you. What you face frees you. She thought she could dismiss me like an outdated portrait from a wall. She wanted white and austere. But when my friend opened his binder and laid down the ledger, she understood the one rule that never loses. Truth comes to the table, hungry and on time. On Thanksgiving night, it took her chair. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.